My name is Dr. Christina Maria Ponzio. I am an assistant professor at Grand Valley State University, and today I'm sharing with you a presentation called At the Slash, Conceptualizing Critical Autoethnography through Gloria Anzaldua's Nosotras framing. First, I'd like to give you some context. In the study for which I conceptualized Nosotras critical autoethnography, my purpose was to disrupt the ideological constructions that both emerged from settler colonization in the US and continue to perpetuate them, specifically constructions that privilege whiteness, native English speaker status, and white mainstream English. To this end, I sought to intentionally decenter myself in the dominant ideologies that privilege my racialized identity and language practices. Decentering myself in this study required conscious interrogation of my positionality as a white US-born fourth-generation immigrant, first-generation college student, and English-dominant speaking scholar. As I began this study, I questioned whether it was my place to undertake autoethnography, given my privilege as a white English-dominant speaking US-born educator, which seemed to contradict a defining characteristic of autoethnography. According to Mary Louise Pratt, unlike traditional ethnographies where, quote, European metropolitan subjects represent to themselves their others, usually their conquered others, unquote, autoethnographies are written by the so-called defined others. While my autoethnography would not center the experiences of the other, I did envision it as a rejection of canonical ideas about what research is and how research should be done based on white, heterosexual, male, middle to upper class, Christian, and able-bodied perspectives. Rather than representing my experiences to others solely from my viewpoint and within the taken-for-granted ideologies that constructed my privileged positions, I wanted to adopt an approach that would allow me to analyze within my interactions the influence of the dominant ideologies into which I had been acculturated, and to catch a glimpse of myself from the viewpoints of those with whom I interacted, namely language minoritized speakers. In Anzalduan terms, I wanted to engage in autoethnographic self-reflexivity through the eyes of others. By this, I refer to Anzaldua's supposition that while we might begin on the opposite riverbank from those with whom we interact, we eventually have to leave the opposite bank so that we are on both shores at once during our journey to new consciousness. To that end, I began to conceptualize a form of critical autoethnography that might take as its starting point Anzaldua's Nosotras framing, where I intended to simultaneously look at myself as subject and object. I also questioned whether it was my place to draw so heavily on Anzaldua's work throughout this study. To this end, I began with a commitment to make central to the perspectives of those, in Spivak's terms, have been positioned on the margins but had reclaimed marginality. Thus, I aligned with Anzaldua's theoretical and methodological perspectives, all born from her experience in the literal and figurative borderlands between Spanish, Nahuatl, and English, and between US and Mexico. I had discovered that Anzaldua herself was an English teacher and the director of bilingual and migrant education in Indiana, a Midwest neighbor of my home state of Michigan. Like me, she identified as a queer woman and was a first-generation college student. Thus, while I knew I could not understand Anzaldua's theories from the vantage point of an insider with regard to my race and language practices, I did recognize her in her writing situated perspectives that might support my endeavor to decenter myself in my privilege as a white US-born native English-speaking language teacher and teacher educator, and instead center language minoritized speakers in the US. Anzaldua's Nosotras framing helps me navigate the tension of taking up her theoretical perspectives, particularly since she herself questioned whether she was guilty of appropriation. As a sixth-generation Chicana, Anzaldua grew up along the US-Mexican border and learned both English and Spanish. During her childhood, she and her family migrated between Texas and the Midwest. Throughout much of her writing, Anzaldua drew upon the indigenous Nahuatl roots from which she had been separated through settler colonization. While she questioned whether she might be misappropriating Nahuatl language and images, she also felt herself to be a part of a profound connection with community outside herself, which was fundamental to her conception of nosotras. Feel free to pause the video here to read this quote to yourself. I adopt Anzaldua's Nosotras framing in my methodological approach to conduct a form of critical autoethnography that considers who I am at the slash, where I attempt to see from both shores at once. According to Anzaldua, writing is not about being in your head, it is about being in your body. The body responds physically, emotionally, and intellectually to external and internal stimuli, and writing records, orders, and theorizes about these responses. Therefore, in conceptualizing Nosotras autoethnography, I make central what I learn from the body, from physiological reactions in moments of conflict and collision, from the emotions that emerge in moments of questioning and fracturing, and from the sense of connection and community that result in transformation. In connection with Anzaldua's assertion that the body is the ground of thought, my emotional reactions help me recognize my shadow self and cracks in my deconocimiento. Therefore, throughout my analysis, I identified points of emotional tension, which indicated fractures in my deconocimiento, through which I began to see myself, my interactions, and the ideologies that circulate within from both shores at once, or from both nos and otras. I now turn to an example from my interactions with a collaborative self-study group in which I participated as a part of my data collection for this study. In preparation for one of our early meetings as a group, we read an article that invited us to consider our respective positions as native and non-native English speakers. For the members of the group who are positioned as non-native English speakers, the article resonated with their experiences as multilingual speakers. For one member, the article helped them question the lack of efficacy and privilege assigned to them, as well as the disparate opportunities available to non-native English speakers pursuing jobs as English educators compared with native English speakers. They also shared their self-consciousness about their accents when they speak English, as well as the criticism they experience when they use English in their home countries. Around the time our group began meeting, I began explicitly acknowledging the doubt, guilt, and shame I felt as a self-defined monolingual ESL teacher who, quote, often felt like a fraud, unquote. These feelings surfaced whenever I acknowledged the inequity, the lack of reciprocity, and potentially the lack of empathy underlying my expectations that students learn English as an additional language while I remained safe and comfortable in my monolingual English privilege. Sharing these doubts with the group was the first time I truly made this admission public to other educators. In this moment, I began to explicitly recognize the monolingual disposition in English language teaching, not as the advantageous marker of the static ideal native speaker privileged by linguistic imperialism, but a deficit in multilingual teaching contexts. I also recall being struck by the fact that as a white native English speaker, my emergent bilingual capacity was marked by my privilege, contrasting with how these practices might be read differently than my group members when they were seen as show-offs for using English in their home countries of China and Brazil. Our group also extended our interrogation of access to and privilege in becoming bilingual within the context of socioeconomic analysis. We considered how each of us might feel differently about the term bilingual based on its associated social capital within our respective contexts. The group members from Brazil, Mexico, and China all highlighted that while learning English as a dominant global language is assumed to provide social capital and increase their social mobility, opportunities to do so are limited to the upper class. In connection to my earlier admission of feeling like a fraud as a self-defined monolingual ESL teacher, I contended with my own social class as another layer of shame emboldened by my group members' contributions. I shared how my own opportunities to expand my bilingual capacity were also limited by my family's financial status. I also took to heart that unlike my peers from countries outside the US, my social mobility was not necessarily tied to my bilingualism. Thus, our group's discussion raised my awareness of additional intersectional dimensions of privilege and oppression in association with language and language learning. Although I would not be able to name it as such until much later, I began then to consider how I could simultaneously be nosotras, or us and others, both language colonizer and colonized. To paraphrase Anzaldua, through writing, we write ourselves, undergoing ongoing transformation as our writing takes shape on the page. The data I share here illustrates how composing a Nosotras autoethnography was facilitated by the overlapping nature of the collaborative self-study in which I was engaged, alongside my independent self-study. As I contended with my own past experiences, I was able to make them public during our meetings, where my experiences were literally juxtaposed with the various positionalities and experiences of my colleagues. During these interactions, I was intentional about listening and engaging with my colleagues' input from their standpoints, once again allowing me to examine my narrative from multiple viewpoints. Finally, as I continued to engage in the process of analysis and writing, I also attempted to adopt the same intentional practices that I had developed through interaction with my group. These included moving toward the discomfort of defensiveness, guilt, and humility on the periphery. Through what I call Nosotras critical autoethnography, I came to recognize this discomfort as a, quote, light in the dark, unquote, to use Anzaldua's words, and evidence of my emerging conocimiento as I rejected the dominant, dehumanizing assimilationist ideologies into which I had been acculturated. Thank you. I look forward to being in conversation with you all.